name is Joe Lasqo, and I'm interviewing Ilya Rostovtsev today in connection with the 12th Annual Outsound New Music Summit. At the Outsound New Music Summit, we will be presenting movements 3 and 4 of Ilya's suite called Understatements. And in conjunction with that, we'd like to hear a little bit about how Ilya got to understatements and where he's gone from understatements, as well as a good discussion of that wonderful piece itself. So Ilya, I'd like to start by asking you about the very beginning. Tell me about your childhood. How did music come into your life?
Sure. Actually, I'm glad you asked me about childhood, because I think all of it sort of like combines into a specific thing. So I was born in the last decade of the Soviet Union, and like as I was growing up, things were changing rather rapidly, particularly around '91 when the Soviet regime came to an end. Around the same time, I started playing piano in the music school, or maybe a little bit before that. So then the Soviet regime came to an end, and it's really difficult to describe what happens in a young person's mind when every single like authority figure in his or her life takes back every single piece of propaganda that they ever threw at you. This very idealistic regime that was based on propaganda that talked about the great communist future and Lenin and everything else. Like my first school assignment in the first grade for reading was they passed out the ABCs. And then in the ABC book, the first page was a portrait. It was a portrait of Lenin, and the assignment was to tell a story about Lenin. So that's sort of what I grew up with. And then after that, all of the same people tarred and feathered that very system. So because of this, growing up, I sort of had this realization that maybe idealist things are not particularly forever. And this notion of timelessness sort of transforms into me identifying very heavily with the postmodern aesthetics in composition and in art making. And right now, so I played piano as a little kid, and it was, more or less easy because you don't have responsibilities or rent or any of those other things. And then in 1996, I moved to the United States, that's when I sort of stopped playing piano. I stopped pursuing classical music.
How old were you then?
I was 13.
Okay.
I was 13 at the time, and then I sort of discovered that I can make music with my computer. So very early on, I started making what I think colloquially is referred to as techno music or electronic dance music or whatever you want to call it. And so I've done that for a long time, for a lot of years actually. So from around '98 until about 2005 and 2008, somewhere in between, I was still working on music like that. And I got a degree in applied math from Texas A&M University because my parents thought that it would be best if I had a real degree as opposed to a music one, which is a very common story, and in a way they were right, and I'm very grateful for the knowledge that I picked up in math school. Now, math is another thing that I think plays into me identifying with the postmodern set of beliefs, mostly because mathematics as a whole keeps changing, and there is a lot in pure mathematics that is not particularly useful, but is also very beautiful and is also very exciting. But at the same time, one of my professors described it as like a graveyard with really incredible tombstones that are monuments to human intelligence, but at the same time serve no practical purpose whatsoever. So it's just something that people do, and in a way, I see that music, illogically, actually needs to strive to be something other than this. So, in art music, I would like for us not to be deliverers of tombstones in a graveyard, but actually be a relevant force in the cultural discourse of humanity as a whole. So after I graduated with a math degree, because I was dating this girl who's now my wife, and we both had very responsible degrees that were supposed to be good for us, but we both were really unhappy with the way that our lives were going.
Okay.
So we actually, based on her incentive, I didn't know that it was possible. But she said why don't we go back to school? And I thought I guess we could do that. So we went to University of North Texas, where I got my master's in music composition with emphasis on computer music. And the piece that you're going to play, the movements of which are going to be featured, is actually my thesis, my master's thesis, written at UNT. So we went there, and Blair, my wife, did visual art. So she's a visual artist, and I did music composition, which probably means that our kids will turn out to be accountants, because there's no way for them to remain in the art field. with daddy composer and mommy painter. So, that's that.
That's great to understand that trajectory, and it's a very, very interesting one. Are there certain composers or musicians or techno bands that were particularly important to you?
Oh, of course. I discovered Stockhausen at this very fragile age of 16 when I had a very thick Russian accent and where I was already a very unpopular kid in school. And then this fellow producer on the internet who also made electronic sort of dance music, he told me to listen to this piece called Contacte. And he said that it was that it was one of the best things done with electronics. So I asked my dad to get that for me from the Texas A&M library, and they had it. And I listened to the CD, and I remember the first time that I heard it. I mean, at first I had all of these expectations as to what the music should be, and I listened to the full 30-minute version, and it blew my mind. I discovered Xenakis and John Cage and a lot of other Stockhausen pieces through that very service, just downloading MP3s and listening to them. And it was particularly exciting to hear some things that I couldn't understand how they behaved and how they were structured, but it was very exciting nonetheless to hear them and then to want to learn about them. So actually throughout Texas A&M, whenever I was working on my math degree, I worked at the music computing lab there and the recording studio. So, and I took a lot of classes for like music composition, electronic music composition, and other things like that. That was the first time I started learning about Max MSP and learned a whole bunch of digital audio workstations and stuff like that. So I actually think like throughout my whole life, I always did something with music. Like the political regimes changed and a lot of other things changed, but the music part remained the same. Like I was always a nerd who wanted to learn more about this sort of thing, and it was always easy to do so, because of the internet and because of the way that computers sort of play.
Let's talk a little bit about the piece that's going to be played in the Outsound Music Festival, Understatements. What I'd like to ask you about first is actually just the title of the piece and its significance. And then, so there are some terms that we've talked about in the past that are very important for understanding that piece. I'd like to ask you about them, and then talk about the movements 3 and 4 from there. So, why did you call it Understatements, or how does that word come into play in the music?
Well, one of the sort of really dear experiences to me is, like in popular music in particular, there are stories of like playing records backwards and hearing hidden messages. There are like, and then there was this band called Boards of Canada that sort of took that notion and like ran crazy with it in their 2000 album called llya. So when working on studio composition, I thought that I had the perfect vehicle to be able to hide things, to conceal things, and to reveal things based on the fact that I had complete control over the full sonic experience of the piece, right? Because in studio composition, you produce the whole thing from like the beginning to the end, and you make sure that it behaves just right and that it sounds just right. But there was also this notion of like how much depth can I get? So I thought that it would be very interesting to create a piece where that had a nice sort of surface to it, but at the same time had would reward attentive listening. And because if I can sort of get on a minor tangent, it's really difficult in the world of composition to get multiple performances of pieces, particularly as a student. But like large ensemble composers complain about that all the time.
Certainly.
Yeah, so that you write a piece for orchestra and then it gets played maybe once and then after that never again. Well, with studio composition, because the piece is fixed and because of my ability to send it out or to put it online, there was a question of like, okay, so not only do I want people to listen to it multiple times, but I also would want people to actually to get something from multiple listenings, like to hear things that they haven't.
I think that is really great. That makes a lot of sense to me as a listener to the piece, because it has this darkly glittering surface in all of the movements. But then as you repeatedly listen to it, you find that there is this strange kind of non-climactic, climactic point. It isn't so obvious. There's an understated climax in each of them.
Yes.
But you don't hear that the first or once or twice that you hear the piece. It's only later that comes out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So one of the concepts that's very important for that piece is the concept of factura, which was originally developed by Russian constructivists. And could you talk a little bit about that as a basic idea, and then we can talk about some of its variations in the piece?
Sure. Ever since I moved to the United States, in many ways, because I was very insecure about my Russian accent and because of other things, I sort of left the Russian culture behind in a very sort of conscientious way, that I wanted to be like as American as I could be. And what was interesting is that as I got to University of North Texas and over the course of my studies, I've noticed more and more things about my country that I never really knew. And I started discovering specific things that I thought were really remarkable, and it's something that I never learned of back when I had lived in Russia. So Russian constructivism was one of those things. And when sort of stumbling across it, it made perfect sense to me to apply these concepts to electroacoustic music. So factura is this fairly fancy word that literally means surface properties of a particular material. So whenever the Russian constructivists would work on sculptures, the sculpture would be wood, or would be metal, or it would be paper, or whatever else.
And what material it was made out was very important, right?
Yes, and I mean those material properties sort of became crucial to the definition of the piece. So how do you compose with these materials makes perfect sense in light of based on your material choices.
Sure.
And so I've read more and more about that, but Alexei Gan, this one of the Russian constructivists, had a different definition of factura, which was a material rationally, knowingly chosen and rationally deployed. So it became this, and that
the way a craftsman would apply
exactly,
material in making a musical instrument or
right.
something like that.
Yes,
right?
or it just so in that respect, when choosing instruments, it became really important to not only choose an instrument based on some sort of like an arbitrary preference, but also to be cognizant of the fact that every instrument is capable of a lot more than only the things that it was designed for. Like if you give a kid a toy, a kid breaks that toy, but they don't do it because they hate the toy, but because they want to see everything that the toy is capable of. Right? So they want to see this full gamut. And the same thing can apply to particular instruments. Now, naturally, most musicians will be very upset if you break their toys. But that said, you can, so because of this, I was able to, I was really lucky to work with very open-minded musicians on the piece that were all my friends. They were all students of composition, and they all, and all of them had, great input in terms of, having ideas about acoustic sound design that would never ever occur to me.
Oh, right.
And, so choosing the instruments, in part, was also dependent on, which people would I get to work with, and, what is it that I've heard them do with their instrument that I really found to be very remarkable.
Oh, especially in the area of extended techniques and non-traditional usages, right? Yeah. So you talk about various types of factura, instrumental factura, behavioral factura, process factura. Could you talk a little bit about each of those three types?
Sure. So the first would be the instrumental factura, which was at the beginning of the piece, that was sort of the only thing that I had going, and it seems somewhat similar to the way that Lachenmann uses the sonic totality of an instrument. So it was this idea that if we have an instrument, we don't have to only pluck the strings on a little zither instrument that I've used for the first movement, but you can also rub certain things across the wood, you can detune it, you can put the microphone inside and produce all kinds of different effects. So this idea is that record the largest amount of sounds possible that would identify the surface properties of the instrument. So to capitalize on the fact that it's a wooden body that would be resonating as opposed to, say, a metal one or something else. So in turn, this gives me this very rich vocabulary of acoustic source sounds. These source sounds can then be processed, and sort of the second thing that came across was that I can apply the same notion to the notion of digital processing. So digital processing applied to different sounds still can sound somewhat similar depending on what sort of processing it is. Like for instance, if you filter certain things out, you can make two different source sounds sound very dull or very bright depending on how you're doing, how your filters are set. So there was this idea of using a consistent set of processing parameters across different families of instruments in order to create things that could melt together, that could go together.
Right, so not only would you have the characteristic factura elements of the pedagolochka or the violin or the clarinet, but also distinctive processing elements and their factura as well.
Yes, absolutely. Now the third one was this notion of I really was struggling with the second movement a lot because I was using a clarinet and you cannot really like beat up a clarinet in acoustically interesting ways. Like we've tried, but the thing is, all of the different things that we recorded weren't particularly exciting sounds. So as I sort of thought more and more of different things, I started thinking of like, well, what is it about the clarinet sound that makes it sound like a clarinet? So instead of trying to overstretch the possibilities of a clarinet as an instrument, I can use a different instrument that sounds somewhat similar for the right ways. So I've used an accordion also because it's a reed instrument, but because they're different reeds and from clarinet. So they're made of metal and they behave in different ways. And then find different ways of making the two sort of come together. Now, at the same time, I was able to extend the acoustic language of the piece tremendously by looking at this notion of a behavior. So what exactly like happens as a musician blows into a clarinet, or the way that a strap of an accordion it was a really ancient accordion that I used for recording, and the strap made this really amazing crackling noise that became not only the foundation for some of the acoustic sounds found in the piece, but also was extended by observing that these types of cracks sounded an awful lot like the sound of ice melting in a bowl,
or raindrops on a
surface. So that this way, so figuring out these sort of similarities between different sonic worlds became an important feature of how I would deal with.
Something that I found really brilliant in this piece comes from your idea of source bonding too, because you can describe the technique much better than I can, I'm sure, but starting off with an identifiable sound and moving from that into a totally unidentifiable or acousmatic space, but retaining the original identification that the listener made.
Yes.
So if you could talk a little bit about acousmatic sounds and how you use source bonding to move between instrumental and acousmatic, that would be great.
Sure. So the term acousmatic literally means from beyond the veil. And Greek philosopher Pythagoras had this idea that students would pay attention better and learn better if they couldn't see the instructor. So he would deliver these lectures from behind the screen or behind the veil. And this idea of sound that is disembodied, that the source of which is not is not known to you directly, is sort of the cornerstone of the development of electroacoustic studio music over the course of the 20th century. This idea that we had synthesizers and we had all of these very exotic sounds that we could capture with a microphone or create with synthesizers and compose with them, but at the same time without really communicating where those sounds were coming from. So it's this very abstract experience. And I mean, because of this, the way that this music is usually presented is in a dark room where you're sort of sitting there and it's cinema for the ear and you sort of let your imagination do the work. But at the same time, there is something really interesting about this notion, is that a lot of electroacoustic pieces use the sounds of nature, which is very clearly identifiable.
The sound landscape approach, which is quite identifiable.
That's right.
And evokes a space, not a disembodied experience.
Yes, but so my question was okay, so if we can, in a way I felt that there was a path that was already pre-paved for me by soundscape composers, of saying that, well, if we can use identifiable sounds, would it be possible to take something that is extremely identifiable within composition? What if we took violins and clarinets and percussion instruments? And how can we compose with this idea of going to and from the ability to identify certain things? So we can identify the source sound, then we can, then perhaps we can not identify the process version of it. But nonetheless have these particularly important features of factura, shine at you beforehand. So that enables me to deal with foreshadowing in clever ways. For example, the ending of the fourth movement consists of this Tibetan singing bowl that my sister brought me from abroad. Now, the sounds of that Tibetan singing bowl are actually embedded throughout the whole piece. It's very early on that you begin to hear those sounds, but they're not identifiable in the same way that they are at the end, because at the end they're almost not, apart from reverberation, they're completely untreated. And then, so the singing bowl sort of is implied over and over again throughout the whole piece, so that by the time that the singing bowl actually sort of manifests itself, it makes perfect sense that because you've heard the sort of like rubbing.
So it's
circular
like
type of
the
motion.
sky is getting gradually lighter and lighter
Yes.
before the sun actually comes up.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
So you are playing with identifiability as one of your musical
Yes.
variables in this mixture.
Right,
Yeah.
because I mean, it's really neat to think of composition as like we get to design a full experience now, right? We can take a lot of things into account that may not have been taken into account before. So, and by saying not taken into account, I mean outside of the 20th century, because most of these things have been
But
explored
before these things were fully controllable by
Right.
composers anyway,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
So that this way, I think that if you're working on a piece for like of chamber music for a chamber hall, like it makes perfect sense to be cognizant of the fact that there are certain things that can happen on stage that are a lot more exciting than if you don't sort of like pre-compose those things in advance.
Yeah.
So, and like so it gives you a whole lot of other things to like work on, and I find I want to compose everything, right? Like I'm sort of a control freak, and part of it has to do with my studio aesthetic of being able to control every tiny little element, and that like I think that it's a very exciting way of thinking about music and about creating an experience and about making sure that if people, if the general audience has like no comprehension of what's going on, then that is for a reason, and that's because something will manifest like later on.
Right, that's part of the piece, that should be the way it is at that time.
I mean,
right?
it would be really wonderful to create a moment where like a large percentage of an audience can go, aha, like at a certain point in time.
Like when the Tibetan bowl becomes clarified.
Right, but
right?
I mean, I'm not 100% sure if Understatements is particularly successful at that, because that really depends on like how people are hearing the piece. And like having, it's been a long time since I've written the piece, and every time that I hear it, it's funny because I forget certain things that I've worked on, and I think that some things that some of the decisions that I made in the piece work well in spite of my ideas. So now that I've forgotten how I was supposed to listen to this, certain things work in a very different way, but nonetheless I'm very happy with them.
It's interesting that you bring up Pythagoras and the veil with your discussion of acousmatic sound too, because it makes me remember that Freud always insisted that his patients not be able to see him speaking to them.
Is that right?
Yeah, that he sat behind them and the voice was disembodied, asking them questions and so forth, to dislodge them from their normal reality a bit. So another concept that is very important for you in Understatements is layers. Could you talk about what layers mean for you in this context?
Sure. So I'll sort of start simply and discuss the technique, and then sort of discuss how that technique can be applied in different compositional settings. One of the composers who inspired me a lot back in the day was György Ligeti, and this idea of so I wanted to create something that had microscopic textural variations. And the way that I decided to go about it would be to take a sound, whether like something that I've designed myself or something that I've recorded, and then copy paste it in a multi-track editor multiple times, and then process these copies separately in a variety of different ways. And then after that, to be able to draw automation curves like very carefully and do all of this by hand to sort of have different aspects of these process copies sort of like come through in different ways. And this was, there are several ways why I really like doing it. One of them is because for any sound, all of a sudden I had a way to make it rhythmic. So even if you have something very static, because of the textual variation and because of the way that I can draw these envelopes for the process copies, I can actually make a certain rhythm emerge from these
that's
types of
really
things.
quite fascinating. A quote that I came across from you that I wanted to ask you about is that you had said, "I'm fine-tuning my approaches to generating perceptible rhythmic structures within a design space that isn't guided by grids or meters."
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think so. Every composer sort of has like these, I don't know, dreams, goals, whatever you would want to call them. And some of them might be really unreachable, but they're important to have because that keeps you working forever and ever. And one of the things that I really enjoy about music and about making music in a computer is this magical moment that happens when you move sounds about in an editor. And then there is this moment where things lock down and you no longer perceive them as discrete sounds. It actually becomes music in this really monumental way. And the way that those like once that happens and you sort of end up with something, like it almost feels that you weren't responsible for it. That it was just something that you've discovered as opposed to something that you've invented. And what I work really hard on is to make sure that all of these things sound effortless. And this idea of like rhythmic perception is that it needs to communicate that this is the way that sounds are organized because that's the only way they can really exist together, without making it appear clever or making it appear like overly designed. It's something that, it's this like fantastic way with which the way the musical material manifests itself that can actually communicate both like what to anticipate and then both like please you in
right. Because the essence of rhythm is the organization of time.
Yes.
So you're talking about, in some ways, what I might call, from my point of view, a rhetorical or grammatical approach to rhythm, which is saying, okay, we're indicating demarcations of structures and setting up mechanisms of anticipation and fulfillment. It's not necessarily the same as indicating time cycles.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Because grids are one way of going about it, but you can, but you don't have to have a grid necessarily.
Right.
So, like when working on this piece, I've had this conversation with my thesis advisor. I came in one day and I said, I spent a whole night last night, and only thing that I did is like these 18 seconds because this sound gave me a tremendous amount of problem, like just fitting it just right. Because you would move things around in time with these like micro rhythm, like micro timing, and then you would listen to it and it would sound right, but then you listen to it in a greater context and all of a sudden it doesn't sound right. And my thesis advisor, John Christopher Nelson, laughed and he said, "Oh yeah, like that happens all the time." And so it's nice to know that that everybody sort of deals with this with this notion of like making sure that the anticipation part works and that fulfillment works, or sometimes the lack of fulfillment also needs to work in a certain way.
So, let's talk about the third movement of understatements, kind of taking off from some of those ideas, because I think one of the challenges of that movement, to me, is that in a way it's one of the more acousmatic movements.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Sorry, I'm thinking of a different one. Erase.
Okay.
I was thinking of the fourth movement rather than the third.
So the third is the most acoustic, I would say.
Well, so let's talk about the fourth then, and then come back to the third. But so one of the things there is the anticipation of coming with the identifiable sounds, the Tibetan bowl that comes in, and starting off with rather non-identifiable analogs. You use the bass drum, a snare, a tam-tam, and a Tibetan bowl, and some techniques like dragging the rubber ball across the membrane of the drum, which are now rather commonplace in music. But the result is fantastic and very different, and it has to do with the layering that you did in something, and some of the other transformations you applied. So could you talk a little bit about how you approached the material in that?
The fourth movement is probably like one of my favorite to talk about because it was just such I had an amazing time working on it. In part because I was collaborating with this very good friend of mine. We've collaborated on several projects together, and he's a percussionist composer. His name is Jonathan Jackson, and we've done like an installation together after the fact, and we're looking forward to working on something in the future. But Jonathan is remarkable because he has two things that I haven't seen very much. He has an ear that is unbelievable. The way that he hears texture is the same way that like a lot of people would talk about composers being able to detect pitch. So and he cares about the sound quality in the studio more than I did, which is saying a lot. So we would do a few takes on, with a concert bass drum or with something else, and then Jonathan would say, like, well, actually, could I have 10 more takes because I could do it a lot better than what it is. And even though these techniques, as you pointed out, are quite commonplace, what Jonathan did in the studio is something that I feel, I don't deserve to own it, but I totally owned it for understatements because he let me keep this. And it's really his acoustic, like his attentive, sort of approach to acoustic sounds, because all I've really done is like I changed I've resynthesized some of them using different techniques, but I mean there is so much of like just Jonathan's unprocessed things that are hidden along the ways, along the unfolding of the fourth movement, and they fit and they sound electronic and they sound very alien.
Yeah.
And that really comes from like the fact that he was a collaborator.
He can really play that way. Yeah. And I think you use some techniques like making copies of the bass drum and then sort of retuning them to approximate the partials of the Tibetan bowls and things like that.
So I mean, I've done like there is a bunch of different things with sort of like detuning of things, because they're really noise sounds to begin with, and noise sounds are they're both easier and harder. So it's much easier to get something like working combination, but it's really hard to make sure that all of these things sort of imply a consistent spectral space. So a consistent like set of like overtones, an inharmonic overtone series. So when working on that in the studio, like for some reason it came together quite naturally. I think because the sounds were really good, and because Jonathan, like I think, was listening in advance with how things were going, and when he was bowing the tam-tam, he knew which partials that he would capitalize on. It took a very long time recording. It was like it took like several DVDs just to store the source sounds, but it was a joy once the right takes were sort of like cut up and put into the digital audio workstation, because after that sort of the arrangement of that and processing of that was very, very, very easy.
And the spatialization in that movement is marvelous, despite the fact that it's actually only really 2 channels.
Yes.
And the challenge was a high one, I think, because to spatialize an acoustically recognizable instrumental sound or a soundscape sound like an animal or the sound of rain is easy, because the mind of the listener has reference.
Right.
But to spatialize abstract sounds is so much more difficult, because you don't know if, say, the reverb is part of the sustain of the original theoretical sound, or if it's actually a property of the illusionary space that is being designed around it. And you did amazing things with being able to give that spatial sense in that very abstract way that coalesced in the more concrete sounds of the ending.
Part of it came from the like recording techniques as well, so that it's always wise to put multiple microphones on the same thing. So even if you're recording the same sound, so all of a sudden the right channel could actually be recorded from across the room, right, and mixed somewhat with the left channel that is actually much closer.
I see. Right.
So that this way it's a way to actually harness the physical manifestation of sound and to be able to use it in like in interesting ways. And this comes along again with the layers notion, because it's the same sound, and I made sure that everything was synchronized. So it's the same sound, but recorded with 5 different microphones in 5 different positions. And I mean, in a lot of cases, it's overkill, and I would only just keep 2 or 3 that are most important. But nonetheless, like it always sort of overproduce and always like edit tremendously. Like that's sort of the mantra.
So now let's really talk about movement 3 a little bit too. So each of these movements has certain source instruments, like 4, which we've been talking about, is basically percussion instruments. The 2 is coming from the clarinet and the accordion. What's the source instrument, and how is it used for number 3?
So the movement 3 was done with a violin, just a solo violin, performed by another colleague of mine. She was a Ph.D. student at University of North Texas named Sarah Summer. And Sarah showed me a lot of things that I haven't heard before, and they're not all of the techniques are really useful in acoustic writing, because they require tremendous amplification and very careful miking.
Right.
So for instance, like the way that she found a way to like drag the bow across the strings without generating any pitch, but with generating very interesting noise.
Oh, for the end part.
Yeah. So I mean, the end part is like is somewhat processed, but at the same time, like it still really came from also from Sarah. So I've had I can't credit them enough.
Yeah, that part was an incredible ending for me, because you took this wonderful alive but non-pitched sound from the lengthwise bowing of the violins and then convolved it with the impulse responses
Yes.
from the tap body.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing. Yeah.
No, so I pitch shifted the sound down, right, because I wanted it to be lower, but I still wanted it to have the features of a violin. So the best way to do it would be to convolve it with the, like convolution is like basically a way to take an impulse response and to sort of give any sound a spatial characteristic of that impulse response. So the impulse response can be like popping a balloon in a room in order to model the reverb of the room. But in our case, we just put a microphone, a little DPA mic inside of the violin, and we tap the violin with the bow and also with knuckles in different ways. And then I'd use like a certain combination of these impulse responses to make that ending.
So the space being modeled is various phantasmagoric transformations of the interior of the violin.
Yeah. But I mean, the impulse responses were not like spectrally altered, right? So they were as dry as possible. And then the lengthwise bowing was pitch shifted down, but even though it's pitch shifted down, it still sounds like it's coming from a violin because of the convolution process.
Yeah, and you use the Colenio technique in that. Can you talk a little bit about how you use that? And you spun it out in quite a few different directions.
Sure. I actually had no idea what the movement was going to sound like, and I didn't really know if the violin would work. So we had a recording session without really like. It was one of those things where we got together and we would just play. So it was in a studio with a bunch of microphones. We recorded a bunch of stuff, but it wasn't really for any particular purpose. It was very sort of open-minded. When Sarah did the Colenio gestures, which is tapping the strings with the bow and letting it ricochet, so letting it like articulate these sort of accelerating rhythmic pulses. I took that, we recorded a whole lot of these things, and then I had this library of different Colenio gestures, and then I had this idea of taking them and combining them in different ways, and it's a very subtle effect, but because it still sounds very acoustic and very natural, but the thing is, none of these gestures can really exist precisely that way in an acoustic space.
Right, because I was amazed by how you were able to design these sequences that sounded almost like they could physically happen, but really were acoustically impossible progressions through subsets of what was going to happen.
Yes. Because as the bow hits the string in different ways, different partials of that string sort of become like manifest themselves. And with the studio recording, you can control these things just by cutting out particular things that you would want. It was a very tedious process, but it also was extremely exciting and exhilarating to be working on this, because even if like after like working for however many hours, you still ended up with under 30 seconds of material. Like the fact that material was done, was finished with, and was useful in a variety of different settings and ways, was extremely exciting, because it was better in a way than a written score, because during rehearsals you ask performers to change certain things, but with that level of control and with keeping things as acoustic as possible, but still making it very much a studio composition piece. So that, that's sort of my answer as to why not use just a violin, or why not just score that, is because the way that the piece is delivered is actually impossible with the...
Right, I mean, because there are these subtle variations where you're panning between enharmonically tuned comb filters on one side and wave shape and modulation versions of the same sound on the other side. I mean, that's not going to happen in very many rooms. It might happen in this room with the... But there aren't very many that really could do that. So, and you took this material, not only changed its how shall I say, its timbre qualities in subtle ways and so forth, but layered the tracks on top of each other as well. What, were you working off a harmonic plan, or how did that work? Specific chords?
Actually, all done by ear. In part because, while working, it's really difficult to talk about this because, I'm trying to remember back. I should have brought my notebooks. There were so many ideas that were undone and redone. I wrote more than 7 minutes for the third movement.
Really?
But the movement is only 3.
Right, it's boiled down a lot since then.
And I've tried many approaches in terms of, because of the tediousness of the work. I've spent about a week trying to do something algorithmically, and the result wasn't as good as doing it by hand.
Right.
So there was a certain handmade quality about it that that I like a lot. That I think was worth the labor that went into it. And when it came to actually organizing pitch, I didn't have good enough notes about which sounds came from which string, and so that wasn't a problem if I had the full gestures, because you can hear which string is being articulated because they were all open strings. However, it became an issue when I had all of these subset sounds of very harmonic driven endings for the collegno.
Right.
So the only way to really organize those in a meaningful fashion was just to make sure that it made sense to me. So just trying different
by ear.
Yeah, and it's all just iterative development. So a lot of times people seem to assume that composers have an idea and they write it down, but in reality the converse works a lot more often. So you write something down, then you listen to it, and then if you don't like it, you can change it.
Yeah.
And that's a very important part of trying things and setting yourself up for as many failures as possible, because each of these failures will probably teach you something.
It's a teaching experience, right?
And then the more that you do it, the better and better sort of the piece gets.
Well, we could talk about these fascinating pieces forever, and actually I would love to do that, but I think we should go on a little bit and talk about what have you done since Understatements, where are you going as a composer, and what's next?
So I'm now a Ph.D. student in composition at UC Berkeley, and I have been doing. So first of all, Understatements was a very important piece for me, because it was the moment where a lot of things that I was sort of experimenting with over the course of my time at the University of North Texas coalesced into something that I take pride in. And for the longest time, for the first year of my time at Berkeley, it was very daunting to have to follow up Understatements with something else, because it was something that...
It's an amazing piece.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your warm words.
Yeah, but I can appreciate the challenge of following up on it. Yeah.
So at the moment, I would like to do more with... I'm very interested in the visual space at the moment. So and that sort of has multiple avenues. One of them is to do visual pieces with video and or with screens. The other avenue, however, is to treat the performance element, and I've sort of talked about this, the performance element of chamber music in a way where the visual components of it are actually notated and are composed. So that this is something that that has a long-term goal, and I'm not 100% sure how successful all of the current experiments are going to be. So I guess we'll wait and see. At the moment, I'm finishing up a big piece that I've been working on for a long time called Crane Mouth, and that piece is going to have several versions, and I'm very excited about it. And that is for electronics and instruments, but because there are different versions, I've yet to finalize which exact instruments are going to be for the to give for the echo ensemble.
Do you see it having only one version in the end, or existing permanently in several versions?
I would like to do a tape version, a solo tape version, mostly because it's a very interesting sort of question after writing the piece for electronics and instruments of how can I design electronic behaviors that don't mimic the instrumental behaviors, but nonetheless are informed by
the kind of narrative sense.
Yes, that function in a similar way. Yeah. Now, the original sort of version is for 7 cellos, and it's going to be cello is a fantastic instrument, but it's kind of difficult to get that performed. So there's going to be a version for a mixed string choir that is going to be. That is going to sound quite different, but nonetheless, I still think it's the same.
It's the same piece, right?
Yeah. So it is very much informed by the same types of notions. And the quote that you mentioned earlier from my blog was the one that
about the non-grid rhythmic structures.
So all of all those. I was talking particularly about the materials used in Crane Mouth.
I see. Wow. I really look forward to that. That will be very interesting indeed.
Yeah, hopefully I can. Yeah, hopefully it'll be done soon, because it's been a long time in progress, and I've had to deal with a lot of changes and different things just because of myself being fickle. But that's okay. That's part of the game.
So if I might close with an odd question, and maybe on 2 different levels. On the general level. So what has surprised you the most in music?
What has surprised me the most in music?
Yeah.
music, like, see, it's...
Or in your musical life.
Not as easy to answer as you would think. I'm going through a tremendous amount of things. I think that at the moment, what I find most surprising is how in a very short period of time, electronic computer tools have grown in a very, very, very remarkable way, particularly when it comes to computer languages, embracing the idea of creativity, so different creative coding platforms, different ways of making it very easy for artists to do much more with the digital medium that they were able to before. And I think that so if I were to be not particularly politically correct, I would say that the most surprising thing is that we're not seeing more of extremely interesting artwork emerging from all over the place with these particular things. And another thing that I find very interesting is that I'm not seeing enough collaboration between graphic artists and between musicians.
Now the tools exist to make that much easier than it has been, right? Yeah.
So it seems to me that, I guess I was also very surprised to end up at Berkeley. Like, I totally did not expect for that to happen. So that is something that I feel tremendous gratitude for. And then in music, particularly in music, what would I find to be most surprising? Actually, the lack of trends. I would say that at Berkeley, I'm most surprised by the fact that that every composer in the graduate program seems to very comfortably occupy an independent republic of him or herself. And and all of the composers get along, and all of us are very, very influenced by each other's music without necessarily feeling like we...
Without creating a school.
Yes, and I think that's a tremendously positive thing, and that is something that I feel extremely excited by. Perhaps it's a feature of just Berkeley or UNT. Perhaps it's a global phenomenon, but it seems to me that this notion of very personal expression is alive and well, and I'm very excited to be a part of it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to chat with you and to learn more about these great pieces and the process that's brought you to them. Thank you very much, Ilya.
Thank you for coming. Bye.